There is a swamp in the southeastern United States where animals go in and do not come out. Not most of them, not the unlucky ones, almost all of them. Scientists have pulled carcasses from the water that show no signs of injury, no sign of diseases, and no sign of a fight. They were simply just dead. The water here is the color of black tea. The ground is not ground at all, and the gas rising from beneath the surface has knocked men unconscious before they even realized they were in danger. This is the Okefenokee, and for thousands of years, it has been killing everything that has entered it. The question is not whether something will die here, the question is what kills it first. The Okefenokee Swamp sits on the Georgia-Florida border, covering nearly 700 square miles. It is one of the oldest and largest intact swamps in North America. The name comes from a Native American word meaning land of the trembling earth. The name is not a metaphor. The ground here is a layer of living plant matter floating on top of water. Peats built up over thousands of years, compressed and soaked. When you walk on it, it shakes beneath your feet. Push a pole into it, and it will sink with almost no resistance. There is no solid bottom in most of the swamp, just layers of decaying material going down and down into the black water. The swamp holds more than 400,000 acres of the floating ground, 60 islands that are not really islands, and over 70 named lakes. It drains into 2 rivers, but drains slowly. The water here moves at almost no speed at all, and still water is where everything dangerous in this place begins. The water in the Okefenokee is not normal water. It runs at a pH between 3.5 and 4.5, roughly the same level as acid as tomato juice. The color comes from tannic acid leaching out to the decaying plants and peat below the surface. Every fallen tree, every dead leaf, every layer of rotting matter that has been building up since the Europeans arrived on this continent is slowly dissolving into this water. The level of acidity does not kill large animals at contact, but it strips away at the base of the food chain. Most insects cannot survive. Most fish species cannot reproduce in it. The species that do live here are specialists that have spent millions of years adapting to a place that should not support life at all. Anything that has not made that adaptation does not last long. But the acid is not the first thing that kills you here. The first thing is underneath. The peat that forms the floor of the Okefenokee has been building up for at least 7,000 years. As it breaks down, it releases gas, mostly methane and carbon dioxide rising from the decomposing layers below. In the open swamp, these gases drift away harmlessly, but in pockets, in dense vegetation, in the low areas between floating mats of plants, they collect. Methane does not have a smell. You cannot detect it without equipment, and in high enough concentrations, it displaces oxygen. Researchers working in the Okefenokee have reported feeling sudden dizziness in the areas where gas had pooled. One study noted that in close sections of dense vegetation, oxygen levels can drop low enough to cause unconsciousness. An animal that stumbles into one of these pockets, or a bird that lands in one, has almost no warning, and if it goes down into the water, it does not come back up. The gas does something else as well. Bubbles rising through the peat disturbs the layers beneath the surface. Large sections of peat can break loose from the bottom and rise to the surface without warning, flipping boats, swallowing gear, and completely changing the landscape of the swamp in a matter of minutes. Locals call them blow-ups. Researchers call them peat fires waiting to happen. When the peat is exposed to air, it dries, and the dried peat burns. The Okefenokee has experienced some of the largest and most destructive peat fires in the recorded American history. The 2011 fire burned for nearly a year. It consumed over 300,000 acres and was visible from space. When peat burns underground, the ground itself collapses. New lakes appear, old paths vanish. The swamp reshapes itself, and nothing that had mapped it before can be trusted anymore. There is a specific quality to how fire moves through the place that separates it from any other landscape. A surface fire in a forest burns what it touches and moves on. A peat fire does not move on, it goes down. It follows the carbon layer below the surface, spreading sideways and deeper, burning in directions you cannot see, sometimes for a month without any visible flame at all. A section of the swamp can appear completely undisturbed while fire eats through the ground beneath it. Rangers working in the perimeter of the 2011 fire described patches of solid-looking land that gave away without warning, dropping into underground burn chambers that had been hollowing out the peats for weeks. The swamp will burn from the inside out, and it will not stop until it runs out of fuel or the rain comes hard enough to drown it. The predators are almost secondary to all of this, but they are here. The Okefenokee holds the highest density of American alligators of any swamp in the country. Estimates place the population at around 10,000 to 15,000 animals in the swamp alone. Alligators here grow large, some recorded at over 11 feet because the swamp gives them everything they need and very little competition. They do not need to move far, they do not need to work hard. They wait. The dark water hides them completely. There is no ripple that looks out of place. By the time anything in the water registers a threat, the gap has already closed. But what makes the alligators here more dangerous here than almost anywhere else is the water itself. Wounds inflicted in acidic, oxygen-poor swamp water do not heal. The bacteria in the Okefenokee water are unlike the bacteria in the clean water environments. Any break in the skin becomes an entry point for infection within hours. Animals that survive an initial attack in this swamp rarely survive what comes after. Even researchers working with sampling equipment have reported minor cuts becoming badly infected within days of contact with the water. It is also important to mention that the alligators are not alone. The Okefenokee is also home to several species of venomous snake, including the eastern diamondback rattlesnake, the cottonmouth, and the eastern coral snake. Of these, the cottonmouth is the one that earns its reputation here more than anywhere else. Unlike most snakes that retreat when approached, cottonmouths in the Okefenokee are known to hold the ground and at times actively move toward perceived threats. They are strong swimmers. They are comfortable in the exact shallow vegetation-choked water that anyone moving through the swamp cannot avoid. A strike in a remote section of the swamp is not just a medical emergency, it is a timed event against a place that has no intention of letting you out quickly. And then, there is the way the swamp hides its victims. The density of vegetation in the Okefenokee is unlike any other swamp system in the North America. Trees draped in Spanish moss, thick mats of floating plants called bonnets covering the lake's surfaces, walls of TD shrubs so dense that a person standing 5 feet off a trail becomes invisible. When an animal dies in the Okefenokee, it rarely surfaces in any visible way. The peat absorbs it. The water takes it down. The gas that helped kill it also prevents decay from following a normal pattern. Bodies buried in the peat do not rot the way body rot in open air. Some are preserved for years, others are simply compressed into the layers and never found. Scientists uphold monitoring equipment from the swamp that had been lost for months, found completely intact and pressed flat by the weight of the peat above them. If that happens to equipment, it happens to everything else. For decades, researchers have tried to study the swamp in any systematic way. Most attempts ran into the same problem. The swamp changes too fast. Trails mapped in spring are underwater by summer. Channels open up after blowups that were not there a season before. A research team from the University of Georgia attempting a long biodiversity study in the 1990s found that the grid markers set in the peat has shifted up by up to 30 feet between visits without any visible cause. The floating ground had moved beneath them. There is no stable reference point in the Okefenokee. Every map of it is already out of date. Human disappearances in the Okefenokee are not talked about the way human disappearances in other dangerous places are. There is no single dramatic event, no mass casualty incident. Instead, there is a steady background count stretching back through written records to the early 1800s. A hunter who went in and never came out. A fisherman whose boat was found empty floating in a clear section of water with no sign of disturbance. A researcher in the 1950s who walked a trail he had walked a dozen times was not at the trailhead when his team returned. Search parties in the swamp faced the same condition that took the missing person in the first place. They cannot cover ground quickly. They cannot search the water, and the vegetation closes behind anyone who moves through it. The Okefenokee does not leave evidence. Local officials in the counties bordering the swamp have a policy that is rarely stated publicly. After 72 hours, active search operations are called off, not because of lack of resources, but because the swamp will not give up what it has taken. The searches continue in form, but not in expectation. The records of missing people in Charleston County, Georgia, which borders the swamp's northern edge, shows a rate of unresolved disappearances per capita that sits well above the state average. No study has formally connected this to the swamp. None has tried. Now, the Okefenokee is growing. Sea level rise is pushing salt water further inland along the Georgia and Florida coast. As it does, the water table beneath the swamp rises. The peat becomes more saturated. The floating mats spread. Areas on the edge of the swamp that were dry land a generation ago now flood seasonally. The boundary of the swamp is expanding outward in all directions, slowly but without stopping. Drought years, which are also increasing, accelerate the peat fires. And after each fire, the swamp rebounds into a new territory. Wildlife corridors that once separated the swamp from populated areas are narrowing. Alligator sightings and suburban drainage ditches in southern Georgia have become common enough that local news no longer covers every incident. There is also a mining operation proposed on the eastern edge of the swamp, a company seeking to extract heavy minerals from land directly bordering the protected area. Hydrologists studying the proposal warn that any disruption to the water table on that boundary could destabilize the peat layer across thousands of acres inside the protected swamp itself. The gas beneath would have new pathways, the blowups would increase, the fires would have more fuel. Drainage patterns that have been stable for centuries would shift, and the swamp, which has always been in slow motion, would accelerate. The proposal is still under review. No final decision has been made yet. And in the meantime, the eastern edge of the Okefenokee sits where it always has, indifferent to what gets decided above it. What is difficult to communicate about this place, and what no amount of data fully captures, is the silence. Not the absence of sound. The Okefenokee is full of sound. Birds, frogs, insects in the drier margins, wind through cypress canopies, the occasional low bellow of an alligator echoing across open water. But beneath all of it, there is a quality of stillness that researchers who have spent time here consistently describe the same way. The sense that the swamp is not reacting to you, it does not notice you. It was here before anything that walks through it, and it will be here after. Every creature that dies here, every piece of equipment lost, every map made obsolete by a blowup or a seasonal flood, is simply absorbed, added to the layers, pressed flat, and forgotten. The Okefenokee has been here for 7,000 years. It has burned, flooded, spread, and reshaped itself dozens of times. It has never needed help becoming more dangerous, but the conditions surrounding it now are doing that anyway. Every year, the swamp is a little larger than it was. Every year, the edge between it and everything outside it gets thinner, and every morning, the water is still the color of black tea. The ground still shakes when you step on it, and somewhere beneath the surface, the gas is still rising. It always has been.